Gatti, who is a professor at Loyola University, but he's also one of the editors at Afronomics, which is a fantastic blog that deals with different aspects of investment law, trade law, and is definitely a platform you should check out. So those are our two commentators. And of course, Professor Danny Bradlow is online, and I will also provide some comments. So in the interest of time and to get the ball rolling and to get into it, let's start with the first presentation. I guess Miracle Marqueze is not online. I haven't seen her unless I'm mistaken. And if that's the case, how about I hand over to Dunai Zongwe from Walter Sisulu University to take us through our first presentation.
So I'll be sharing my screen. Can you all hear me?
Yeah, you're loud and clear. And if anyone else can't hear, maybe mention it in the chat.
No problem. So let me know if you can see my slide.
We can see the slide.
Okay, perfect. So I will start right away. As you can see on the slide, the title of my short presentation is Stealing for the Next Public Health Crisis Through Fiscal Responsibility, Namibia's Trial of Strength. If you were tempted to think that nothing could be worse than the current COVID-19 pandemic, think again. Some experts had predicted, even before the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, that the future holds several global pandemics in store. And I'm thinking in particular to Sonia Shah. A book, Pandemic, was published in 2016, and she had already predicted the outbreak of several global pandemics due to demographic and environmental factors. So in light of this development and in light of the unfolding COVID-19 crisis, this presentation seeks to enable developing country governments to balance delicately between short-term liquidity and long-term development. I believe that this type of dilemma lies at the core of the challenges that most countries, especially developing countries, face as they try to weather the wrath of this pandemic, which is arguably the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. So it has created a multifaceted pandemic or pandemonium, which affects the economy, healthcare, and state finances. And my presentation will focus especially on state finances. Unsurprisingly, this situation has set the stage for upheaval and bitter strife within communities and society, and inevitably, most governments will have to borrow money if they wish to pull through this crisis. Borrowing money in and of itself is not a problem, but crucially, in disasters such as this one, public debt tends to shoot up to unsustainable levels. So we are basically dealing with a question of sustainability of public debt. And while economists and scholars have spoken about this difficult dilemma, the literature has remained silent as to how budget system laws could be modified to weather this crisis. And more specifically, the literature has not yet dealt with the budget system law and how it works in the particular case of Namibia. I'll be addressing the situation in Namibia by looking first at fiscal responsibility law in general, and then fiscal responsibility law in the specific case of Namibia. Fiscal responsibility, of course, this concept dates back to times immemorial, but the convergence of fiscal responsibility and the law arose around the 90s when New Zealand came up with the fiscal responsibility law. That fiscal responsibility law has been replicated ever since. The literature has also written quite a bit about it, especially in the case of Brazil. I'm not going to go into too much detail about fiscal responsibility law, but I would say that the main features contain provisions dealing with transparency, deficit ceilings, expenditure ceilings, escape clauses, data sustainability, and sanctions. I would like to draw your attention to to the ceilings, which is really a vital part of these fiscal responsibility laws. Whether you're dealing with deficit ceilings or expenditure ceilings, those are crucial if you want to induce fiscal prudence, including escape clauses, which allow the government to borrow more in case of national emergencies, such as the one dealing here. But questions that we may want to ponder include budget insurance. Borenstein and others have talked about catastrophic risk insurance. Although they were writing in the context of Caribbean nations, the reasoning they've used there could be applied to the current situation. They were saying that because Caribbean nations live or are located in disaster-prone areas, it would make economic sense for them to have some sort of budget insurance. They wrote before this COVID-19 crisis, but if we are to believe Sonia Shaw and similar experts in believing that there will be other pandemics in the future, then it's not far-fetched to say that the world has become, let's say, pandemic prone. And insurance may make sense, although politically it may be very difficult. Another thing that I would like to look at, and I'll concentrate on that a little bit, is the idea of fiscal councils. For example, when we think of fiscal councils, you can think of the US Congressional Budget Office or the Swedish Fiscal Policy Council. Part of the discussion around fiscal councils relates to the location of this council. Are they better located in the executive branch of government, or are they better located in the legislative branch of government, like the US Congressional Budget? I'll come back to that question later, but you may want to ponder these questions sometime. Okay, so let's now look at fiscal responsibility law in Namibia. On the slide, you can see the finance minister. It was in October, after he presented the midterm budget. Quickly, the debt situation in Namibia, debt to GDP ratios have increased from 7% on the year of independence in 1991 to 45% last year. And the cost of servicing public debt in Namibia has reached 200 million Namibian dollars, which is about 11%, which is about 11% of GDP. Namibia currently seeks 4.5 billion rand from the IMF. This is the first time that since independence that Namibia tries to get relief or money from the IMF. And for that reason, you can imagine that this is a matter of great controversy. In the next 3 years, the government expects to borrow 40 billion rand. And that would increase Namibia's debt burden to 158 billion rand. Over the same period, the government will also expects to pay at least 35 billion in interest payments only. And as a result of this pandemic, the GDP is expected to contract by 6.6%. So given this debt situation, the question that we may ask ourselves is, should Namibia adopt a fiscal responsibility law? And let me say as a matter of general observation that there's no actual fiscal responsibility law in Namibia. If you look at the budget relevant legislation, the existing one, you actually have to look at the Constitution, the State Finance Act, the Central Bank Act, and also the Appropriation Acts, commonly known as budget. The Constitution, of course, deals with the welfare of the people, state revenue fund, budgets, and the Auditor General, but there's no provision expressly addressing fiscal prudence. The State Finance Act also empowers the minister to basically borrow money within and outside Namibia, but in this case also, there's no provision expressly addressing fiscal prudence. The situation is a little bit different when it comes to the Central Bank. The Bank of Namibia Act is interesting in the sense that it recasts the central bank as in 5 different roles. As an independent developmental institution, as a fiscal agent, in a fiscal agent role, in a lending role, in a foreign borrowing role, and in a debt manager role. I have to say from the outset that while this may look a little bit unusual, it is actually roles that have been, except for the developmental one, those are roles that are provided for in the SADC central bank model law. But I will quickly tell you the difficulties that I have with it. The Bank of Namibia Act provides for central banking independence, which is entrenching central banking law. It deals with developmental role of the bank, fiscal role, in the sense that, among other things, the central bank may express views on the budget. It also has a lending role and also includes a cap on how much it can lend to the government. As you can see, it says that no more than 5% of the average annual revenue. Revenue is defined for the purposes of that section generally to mean the aid or similar flows that the government receives. And exceptionally, that limit can go up to 5%. So you can maybe think about it as some sort of ceiling. It has also a role when it comes to foreign borrowing role, in the sense that government and government institutions must consult the central bank before borrowing, and the central bank must pronounce itself on whether those terms are financially or economically appropriate. If not, they have to report it. The central bank must report to the finance minister and make recommendations to avoid that kind of situation. It also has a public debt management role in the sense that it acts as an agent for the government when it comes to paying interest, principal debt, and debt-related expenses. Now, some reflections of what I've just said. It's very clear that in this case, the central bank works as a fiscal council, but the question that we may want to ask ourselves is, why was the fiscal council not located in Parliament? And the other question that you may ask yourself is, why is the Auditor General not entrusted with that task? Is there not some inefficiencies related to the fact that the central bank has been entrusted with the role of the fiscal council? That's a question that we may want to discuss. There's also, we have also to take into account that in some countries, there are not really fiscal councils, but fiscal courts, like in Brazil, that perform similar functions. The Bank of Namibia does have, in terms of the new act, which was passed actually as the very first legislation this year, it does act as a fiscal council, but it does so outside of any fiscal responsibility framework or any fiscal responsibility. You may ask me, but why am I making so much fuss about fiscal responsibility law, given that the evidence shows that that the impact of fiscal responsibility law has so far remained inconclusive? My argument is that although the law part of fiscal responsibility is questionable, the fiscal responsibility aspect has actually not changed. In fact, more than ever before, we may have been forced into an age of fiscal prudence because of the unsustainability problem that the pandemic and future pandemics may actually inflict on developing countries. My argument is to say that even when it comes to the SADC central bank model law, what matters more is not where we locate the fiscal authority, but to create a commitment technology, which was defined by Schoenberg and Tambalotti as a technology in terms of which the government can make promises credibly, in this case, budgetary and fiscal promises credibly, and ensure and induce fiscal prudence. I would even say that this commitment technology can be reinforced by having debt sustainability analysis submitted to public debate. This is condoned, not condoned, that's not the term, this is encouraged by the Constitution, section Article 95K, urges the Namibian government to encourage the masses of the population to debate its policies, including its fiscal and budgetary policy. This is a very important point to make. It doesn't really, the SADC central banking model law may create some inefficiencies in the sense that it actually already says where you have to locate the fiscal authority. It doesn't leave that flexibility to the government or to the different jurisdictions. And that in itself may be a problem. I think what matters more is the commitment technology and to make sure that there are more eyes on the budget by having not only the central bank having a say, the Auditor General having a say, the public having a say, but also Parliament to encourage that discussion to have that sustainability analysis as part of the discussion. In other words, what I'm saying is it's important to have a fiscal responsibility framework, even if it's not necessarily a fiscal responsibility, because at the end of the day, the road to fiscal prudence must pass by the fact that we need to have more eyes on the money. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much for that presentation. Before we take any comments and have a discussion, let's get through all three papers. So next we can have Louis Cohen. I hope I'm pronouncing all your names correctly. If I am, and please do feel free to correct me, but Louis, maybe you can come online and share your screen and we can have your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Makhali. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Perfect. Okay. Let me just quickly do the screen sharing. Okay. Good day, everyone. So my paper today will be focusing on the validity of sovereign debt tainted with corruption, and I'll specifically be looking at Mozambique. And so the international community has increasingly recognized corruption as a serious barrier to economic stability and the development of nations and people. And this example will clearly show some of the effects that corruption could actually have on sovereign debt. So what I'm going to do is I'm first going to give a brief background to the disputed debt before proceeding to address the validity of the debt in terms of Mozambican domestic law and then in terms of English law. So in my full paper, I also consider corruption as a jurisdictional bar to investor-state arbitration, but due to time constraints, I won't be going into that during this presentation today, but you are more than welcome to read that in the full paper. So Mozambique launched a series of maritime projects in 2013, which were aimed at securing its exclusive economic zone and to develop a domestic fisheries industry. And to this end, it launched 3 state-owned companies, Pro Indicus, Imatum, and MAM. And these companies jointly incurred debt in the amount of approximately $2 billion United States dollars. That's about 15% of Mozambican GDP. And these debts were all guaranteed by the state. Now, the Imatum debt, which is about $850 million, was disclosed to the IMF in 2014. But the balance of the debt, so the Pro Indicus and the MAM debt, was not disclosed at all, be that to the IMF or to the Mozambican parliament. It was essentially a black hole that nobody knew about. And when the existence of this debt was revealed in 2016, the existence of this debt actually violated the conditions on which the IMF lent to Mozambique. And this saw a suspension of all IMF support to Mozambique. And in turn, foreign aid to Mozambique in many instances is dependent on the continued support from the IMF. So this foreign aid was also withdrawn upon the IMF suspending further financial support or fiscal support to Mozambique, which then resulted in an economic crisis in Mozambique and saw the currency plunge. Since then, it has transpired that this debt has involved corruption with high-level government officials in Mozambique. The former Minister of Finance, Emmanuel Chan, is currently fighting extradition here in South Africa, and he has allegedly received bribes up to $5 million from an Abu Dhabi-based company, Privinvest Group, who actually arranged the financing agreements. Importantly, all of the payments were made directly to Privinvest Group. So the loans which were made by the state-owned entities, guaranteed by the Mozambican government, were all paid over directly to Privinvest Group, who was the contractor for all of these state-owned companies to supply ships and the like. Then briefly addressing the invalidity of these guarantees under Mozambican law. So the Constitutional Council of the Republic of Mozambique has declared all of the secret debts unlawful in terms of the law of Mozambique. And the Mozambican budget laws of 2013 and 2014 provided for a limit to state guarantees in the amount of 183.5 million meticals and 15.7835 billion meticals respectively. Now, importantly, each one of these debts individually exceeded the annual limit, not even considering the combined effect. I mean, the Amartium debt was for $850 million. The Pro Indicus debt was for $900 million. So in each of these instances, each individual guarantee provided by the state or the Minister of Finance exceeded the entire annual limit on state guarantees, which was obviously, again, not reported to Parliament. The Constitutional Council also held Assembly Resolution number 11 of 2016 to be void for illegality. And in this resolution, the Assembly, which is essentially Parliament, it purportedly recognized the Amartium debt. And the court saw this as an attempt to cloak an otherwise void act with legality. And the Constitutional Council found that the Assembly has no authority to actually recognize an invalid and unconstitutional act. So it is now beyond dispute that as a matter of Mozambican law, the guarantees with respect to Pro Indicus and MAM and Amartium are invalid, but also the first Eurobonds emerging from the first restructuring. So importantly, there's been the Amartium debt, which I'll refer to as the Amartium related debt, has been restructured twice. It was first restructured in 2016, but with the advent of the economic crisis, Mozambique could not honor its obligations under these Eurobonds, causing it to default, and it then restructured these bonds again late last year. So as a matter of Mozambican law, these debt obligations are invalid. There's little dispute. But at the end of the day, these debt agreements are governed by English law. The choice of law in all of these agreements select English law to govern the debt. So I'll proceed to address this in terms of English law. So the UK Bribery Act in Section 6 provides that it is unlawful to bribe a foreign official. But as Professor Goldman correctly notes, the Bribery Act does not in itself render a contract void in instances where bribery had occurred. He instead argues that the principle or the extirpi causa rule provides that a court will not aid a party whose cause of action is founded upon an immoral or illegal act. And he then uses this as a basis to say that Mozambique could escape liability for these debts on this basis. However, in my analysis, I disagree with Professor Goldman on that specific point, because the English courts have always distinguished between contracts procured by bribery and contracts illegal in themselves, such as an agreement to pay a bribe. So in the case of Mozambique, assuming the allegations are true, $5 million was paid to the Minister of Finance to secure his signature, making the agreement procured through bribery rather than an agreement to bribe in itself. And in English law, contracts which have been procured through bribery are not unenforceable, as held in the Honeywell and the National Iranian Oil Company cases. Instead, according to both of these cases again, bribery allows the innocent party to avoid the contract at its selection, provided that counter restitution can be made. Now, Professor Goldman has also addressed the issue of counter restitution, and again, he relies on the extirpi causa rule. And I do not disagree with him Although I instead would refer to the case of National Commercial Bank Jamaica Limited versus U, in which the Privy Council held that with a guarantee, the surety incurs a liability but obtains no benefit. So there's nothing to disgorge by way of counter restitution if the guarantee is set aside. Mozambique itself only entered into a guarantee. It did not receive any benefit. It incurred a liability. So there is nothing for Mozambique to disgorge by way of counter restitution. And here we need to distinguish between who exactly is the party before the court. If the Mozambican government is the party, this rule applies. Obviously, Pro Indicus, MAM, and Imatum did receive ships and the like from that funds. So they might have to make counter restitution, but we are concerned here with the sovereign debt on Mozambique's part. But then at the same time, different considerations apply to the restructured Imatum related debt. This is now the Eurobonds. So in English law, a transfer by way of novation is not subject to equities. And Professor Olivares Caminal has made a persuasive argument that during the restructuring, Mozambique had actually novated these debts because the government of Mozambique had replaced Imatum as the principal debtor and had assumed liability for these debts separate from the initial guarantee. And what it means when an agreement has been novated and it's not subject to equities, it means that any defense that existed in terms of the initial agreement does not transfer upon that debt changing. It's a new contract, and the fact that the initial agreement was tainted by corruption would not per se render the second agreement invalid or avoidable at the instance of the innocent party, because it is regarded as a completely new agreement. And in the literature thus far, which has been very limited, it's largely been focused on groups like NGOs who considered the doctrine of odious debts and argued that Mozambique ought to declare the debt as odious and refuse to pay the debt on that basis. However, as I'm sure many of you are aware, the validity of the doctrine of odious debts is heavily disputed in international law. And in either event, even if Mozambique were to establish that the doctrine of odious debts is a valid norm of public international law, the English courts, as a general rule, have held that norms of public international law that has not been incorporated into domestic law cannot be the source of domestic rights or obligations in English law. So an English court would not consider the doctrine of odious debts, even if it has been proven to be a valid obligation. So in my submission, it's not going to aid Mozambique to raise the doctrine of odious debts to avoid repayment of this debt. And ultimately, this places Mozambique in a precarious position because some of these debt obligations are valid. The Eurobonds, it's difficult to argue that these Eurobonds are invalid in terms of considering all of the case law. But Mozambique is facing significant pressure from civil society groups not to pay any of the debt, including the Eurobonds. But while the international investment community in turn expects Mozambique to honor its obligations arising from the Eurobonds. And the international ratings agencies, for example, have also always distinguished between the Eurobonds and the Imatum and MAM related debt. So the ratings agencies do not consider Mozambique to be in default with, particularly Fitch, in relation to the MAM and Imatum debt, even though they're not, the MAM and the Pro Indicus debt, even though they're not making payment on those because they consider that there is a true prospect of success. But with the Eurobonds, Mozambique was considered in default while it was not honoring these obligations. And Mozambique will be in need of significant international financing in the years to come. If it were to renege on these bonds, it could significantly impair investor confidence. And ultimately, if the Constitutional Council finds the latest restructuring, that's the late 2019 restructured Eurobonds, invalid, it leaves Mozambique with equally undesirable options of breaching its domestic law or defaulting upon debt obligations which could be valid in terms of English law. Thank you very much for your time.
Great. So thank you so much for that presentation. That was a very good one. Thank you. Let's move on to the next and the last presentation. So if Marie-Louise Aaron could come online and share her screen, and then we'll get right into hearing what the commentators have to say.
Oops, I can hear. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Oops, what has happened?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, great. All right, so good afternoon, everyone. Please let me share my screen, slide rather. Share. Okay. All right. Hello. Can everyone see my slide?
Yes, we can see your slide. You can proceed.
Great. Okay, great. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'll be doing the presentation using South African situation. And so the title of my paper, my presentation will be South African Sovereign Debt Management, Exploring Creative Approaches to Forestalling a Debt Crisis. So from the beginning, the outset of the global financial crisis made the debt situation globally quite a difficult one. So because of the global financial crisis that occurred from 2007 to 2009, public debt increased tremendously. Like, for example, in South Africa, in 2008, the debt to GDP ratio was about 26%, but currently is about 69%. And so the country, South Africa, has been trying to manage the debt, but the unexpected presence of COVID and its destructive economic effect on the global economy has put most debt management efforts, taking it backward. So what is the socioeconomic effect of COVID-19 pandemic on sovereign debt crisis? Due to national lockdown that a lot of countries imposed, including South Africa, it led to a reduction in economic activities, and the reduction in economic activity also affected revenue generation, particularly from tax. So I think this year it was projected that the tax revenue that will be lost due to reduced economic activity will be over 200 billion rands. So, and because of this discrepancy between expenditure and government revenue, it has shifted the present government's fund to taking steps to containing the COVID-19 pandemic effect on the economy and on people, instead of focusing on infrastructural development. And because of this gap between revenue and expenditure, government borrowing has ballooned, and it's becoming like a quicksand where more debt is coming in, payments, it's difficult to pay, and the economy is down, no revenue coming in. So it's just going in a vicious circle. So I'm going to, before I proceed into my proposed solutions, I want to take us through the evolution of South African's sovereign debt. How did South African sovereign debt start? How did we get to this stage we are? So as contained in my paper, this is just a bullet point. South Africa borrowed from Britain during the 19th and the 20th century, mostly to fund its infrastructural expenditures. But due to the onset of the world wars and the instability that the world brought into the markets, it it decided to create its own domestic bond market. And so it was able to manage its sovereign debt, but the problem started in the 60s when there was a lot of issues in the international debt market, starting with the introduction of the interest equalization tax in the US, which taxed capital leaving the US for investments abroad. And so it made the government move on to an alternative, which is foreign debt. And so during the 70s, sovereign debt began to gradually increase until a debt crisis occurred in 1985. And because of the debt crisis that happened in 1985, there was a restructuring agreements were entered into, and it was quite manageable until 94, when South Africa moved into a democratic system. And public debt rose because of the restructuring program that was going on at that point. But from 96 onward, the government was able to take measures that prevented further increase in debt level. So from 2004 to 2002 to about 2004 to 2007, South Africa committed to a moderately expansionary fiscal regime. So debt was properly managed until the global financial recession started. So when the global financial recession came in, public spending continued without a corresponding increase in government revenue, leading to the debt crisis that we are today, exacerbated by the onset of COVID-19. So what is the implication for debt, rising debt in South Africa? So a study conducted estimated that the threshold level that makes a positive correlation between public debt and growth turns negative at 31.37%. So whenever South Africa's debt level reaches or exceeds this threshold level, then the effect of debt becomes negative. So the implication for the rising debt, sovereign debt in South Africa is high volume of debt and servicing debt diverts public resources from developmental projects. So instead of having funds, public funds going into, say, education, health projects, it's going into servicing public debt. So debt burden shift, also the debt burden, the sovereign debt burden shifts to the private sector through high domestic borrowing costs. We experience this through high interest rates, which reduces private sector investment, particularly in sectors that are heavily reliant on debt financing, which can consequently impair long-term GDP growth. Another implication for rising debt for South Africa is the possibility of stiffer austerity budget. So the government starts reducing essential social service spending for servicing the debt, which in turn affects the economy negatively. So a possible solution to the debt crisis could be more borrowing. But then the question arises that if South Africa continues to borrow, that will also lead to more debt payments, debt servicing payments, in addition to what the existing one. So I looked at what can be done from a policy perspective, and I came up with these ideas. So I looked at debt management. The best way to manage sovereign debt from a policy perspective would be about closing financial leakage channel and charting new courses. So what are examples of these financial leakage channels? One of them is addressing and dealing with institutional corruption head on, because it's counterproductive to keep accumulating debt, and debt goes out through corrupt practices or say state capture. So the best way to handle this issue is to deal with institutional corruption head on. Projects that don't yield the required revenue estimated should be done with. Institutional and bureaucratic corruption should be handled. And one way to handle it is to create independent monitoring and evaluation committees who will be able to look at the benefits of project against estimated benchmarks to know if it's productive or not. Then another aspect, policy recommendation to dealing with debt crisis, is to improve proper and accurate fiscal records and transparency. So most times in African countries, and including South Africa, we tend to depend on fiscal records or debt obligation records from international organizations, and we don't have our own, or the ones we have are not totally reliable. So if we have fiscal records, and these fiscal records and debt obligations we have are made public, and the public can access it before the government goes into borrowing with any organization or from the capital market, it's open to the public for input. It will go a long way in curtailing lack of transparency and accountability that affects proper sovereign debt management. Another policy idea is to avoid frivolous capital market borrowing. In a sovereign debt situation or near crisis, the normal response is to continue to borrow, but the question remains: what funds obtained from the capital market, what would it be used for? So if it's used to sponsor low impact spending, such as spending money on state-owned enterprises that are not productive, then it will be counterproductive to go to the capital market to borrow. So the point is that at this stage, the government should try to reduce its capital market borrowing. And if it has to borrow from the capital market, then it should make sure that whatever money is borrowed is used for productive or high impact spending that is bound to generate revenue. Then the next solution I see is replacing austerity budgeting with GDP enhancing spending. So the temptation is very high in the near sovereign debt crisis to focus on cutting social spending. But studies have shown that austerity budgeting doesn't really achieve desired results. For example, in Portugal was able to declare a budget surplus in 2019 because Portugal abandoned austerity budgeting and replaced it with GDP enhancing spending. So what do we mean by GDP enhancing spending? Like spending that helps to grow the GDP. For example, investments in tourism, investments in ICT, intellectual properties that come from technology. Those are GDP enhancing spending, and it should be encouraged. Then the next solution, policy recommendation, is the extraction of revenue from underutilized sources. So with the onset of COVID, what most countries have been doing is to rely on wealth tax or excess profit tax. So despite the economic activity reduction because of the pandemic, there are still companies that are declaring very excessive profits. For example, Amazon. So a policy direction to go is to also consider those sources and tax them, even if it's temporarily until the economy stabilizes and sovereign debt is properly managed. So in conclusion, it is hoped that by adopting this policy recommendation, South Africa will be able to manage its rising debt crisis level and forestall a crisis, and possibly learn from this situation so that next time, things that will lead to a sovereign debt crisis will be properly managed. So that's my presentation. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much for that presentation. In the interest of time, I think we can go straight to the commentators. So I'd like to first call on Professor Cephas Lemina to hear your thoughts on any of the papers. I believe that you'll be commenting on Cohen's paper. So Prof, over to you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear, Prof.
Okay, I think, well, first of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to participate in this very important event. I will confine my remarks to Louis' paper, the one on the Mozambican sovereign debt. Now, as I understand it, the central theme of Louis' paper is that is the enforceability of agreements in terms of which loans of more than $2 billion were provided by the London branches of the Swiss bank Credit Suisse and the Russian bank VTB to 3 Mozambican state-owned enterprises in 2013 and 2014. These loans were not approved by the Mozambican parliament as required in terms of Mozambican law, and they've since been declared illegal by the country's constitutional council. The paper argues that it cannot be denied that under Mozambican law, the loan guarantees provided by the then Mozambican Minister of Finance and the Eurobonds that resulted from the initial restructuring of the debt are invalid. But the author, Louis, goes on to argue that the invalidity of the loans under Mozambican law does not automatically render them invalid in terms of English law, which is the law governing the loan agreements. And while the UK Bribery Act of 2010 makes it an offense to bribe a foreign official, this does not in itself render the loan agreements void as suggested by one scholar, Goldman, to which Louis referred to. In the author's view, and this is based on a review of the Honeywell case, I think this was a decision of the UK courts. But 2 of the loan guarantees, which is the guarantee relating to the Pro Indicus loan and the Ematam loan, may be enforceable under UK law or under English law. And finally, the paper discusses the enforceability of the loan agreements through investment arbitration. Now, the paper itself raises several interesting issues, some of which have already been dealt with by other scholars such as Goldman, to which Louis referred to in his paper. I have a few comments. The first is that, in my view, the discussion around the enforceability of the contracts tainted by corruption is rather limited. And I think that it would be useful for Louis to delve into more detail around the illegality doctrine to include more cases such as the Patel versus Meza case, which is a UK Supreme Court case in 2016. And in this context, I think it would be useful for him to consider the implications of the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, as well as the UK Bribery Act for the public interest argument in relation to the doctrine of illegality. The second is that I think that the paper could benefit from an expanded discussion of enforceability of the loan agreements by an investment tribunal. He did, of course, refer to or touch on this issue, but I think that the paper requires a bit more discussion of this issue in the context, particularly in the context that investment tribunals apply rules of international law, and that corruption is illegal under international law, notably as reflected in the UN Convention Against Corruption, to which Mozambique and other relevant states, including the United Kingdom, Switzerland, Russia, and the United Arab Emirates are all parties. And all of these states are implicated in this particular unfortunate situation. My final comment is that I believe that the paper could also benefit from a more detailed analysis of the Odia state doctrine, as well as international soft law instruments, such as the UNCTAD principles on promoting responsible sovereign lending and borrowing, particularly principles 1 and 2. As well as the United Nations guiding principles on foreign debt and human rights, all of which, or both of which deal with issues that are implicated in the paper. So thank you. Those are my comments in brief. I hope they're useful.
Yeah, thank you, Prof. Thank you very much. Maybe we can have Professor James Gatti next, and then we can open up the floor to broader discussions and possibly let the authors themselves also respond to some of the comments that have been brought forward. So, Professor James Gatti, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Magali, and thank you, Professor Bradlaugh, and everyone there at the International Development Law Unit at the University of Pretoria for inviting me and for arranging this event. Just to say that I really admire everything that happens there at the International Development Law Unit. It's great to have such a center of excellence on the continent. My apologies, I was unable to join yesterday, but I'm here today and I'm delighted to be commenting on two great papers, Dunia Zongwe's and the other one I'll come to in a bit. So I'll start with Dunia Zongwe's paper. I mean, it's quite well written. I think that he will agree that you know, there are portions of the draft that will require him to complete, as he notes in the paper. But overall, I liked the focus on the fiscal responsibility laws that he spoke about, and I will not go over those. I'll go straight to my comments with regard to sort of probing him further. I know that the papers were written in short order, but I think that there is, and they're pretty brief, so maybe some of these comments that might push this beyond the 15 papers, I don't know, 15 pages, I don't know if that's going to be permissible with the organizers. So the first comment for you, Zongwe, is to wonder aloud, what is the provenance of these fiscal responsibility laws? When we do comparative work and encourage African countries to borrow or transplant laws from other countries, I think it behoves us, it sort of is necessary to understand the context in which those laws arose. I think you may want to find out, for example, whether these fiscal responsibility laws that began in the mid-1980s in New Zealand were part of New Zealand's neoliberal turn, which was associated with huge economic declines and dramatic inequality. And I really do recommend the work of Jane Kelsey, Professor Jane Kelsey at the University of New Zealand, who has really done some really fantastic work that I have found very compelling, that relates the turn towards neoliberalism in New Zealand and the commitment to free flow of finances around the world with what happened in New Zealand in the mid-1980s. And the great thing about New Zealand is that it offers us a really powerful example of the types of things that you mentioned towards the end of your presentation and towards the end of your paper, which is how citizens could use these types of laws if they are enacted, like you mentioned with Article 95K of the Namibian Constitution, to probe public officials when they depart from some of those commitments. And I think that we'd all agree that the excellent work by the civil society groups in Mozambique in exposing the malfeasance of the Mozambican government was really great for all the reasons I'm sure you discussed yesterday and that we've had today. So that's my first point, sort of thinking about the provenance of these laws and what they really mean. And just as a footnote, for example, here in the United States, some of the discussions around balanced budgets, have often been recommended by right-wing politicians who are very skeptical of public spending, even when there are constraints on the budget. So, I think this is an ongoing discussion in many parts of the world, and not just in our part of the world. And the second, so I think the second point really following on to that is, I think that if we are thinking about fiscal responsibility, that civil society groups should be part of the solution, and that any reforms that we think about in this area should take into account the role that civil society groups can play. So for example, in New Zealand, during the height of the turn to neoliberalism in the mid-1980s, the civil society groups there campaigned for the enactment of a law to protect chief ombudsman and for whistleblowing laws that would provide a check on the fiscal management of that country. So these civil society groups did not just leave it to the technocrats that were changing the laws towards sort of the direction of fiscal responsibility, but they wanted to have private causes of action and things like that that provided the foothold that they would use, for example, the judicial system to question what was going on. And even in Brazil, another of the countries that you mentioned, as a place that is providing inspiration for your work, some research shows that a key factor behind greater activism in the state audit institutions were things like the uncertainty generated by electoral competition among state elite groups. And I'll come to this point in commenting also on the second paper. That is that the greater risk of the elite in power losing the next election, the more autonomous the audit courts, for example, became. Even more, they found that the state governments in the federal system in Brazil really provided strengthening in the institutions of accountability. And so I think that the larger contexts in our countries regarding who controls the fiscal responsibilities when there is turnover in the political institutions is really key to how some of these things play out. And I don't know how, for example, this goes to the second paper, I don't know how that plays out in the specific politics of Namibia, or I'm not an expert on that, and neither am I an expert on the South African case, although certainly there it seems that in South Africa, at least the ANC has a stronghold on the state. But they are really powerful civil society groups and labor unions and the like that can provide a counterbalance. The third point is therefore, following from my first 2 points, that sometimes as lawyers, we tend to think that the solutions to the challenges that we're talking about can be resolved solely by legal reforms. And we know from the vast literature in law and development and beyond or even the really excellent work happening on law and society, that we shouldn't be blinded merely by cosmetic legal reforms. So this is a point quite apart from my point about the provenance of these laws. Assuming they would work, I think that we shouldn't rest on the premise that there are now laws in place. And I'm not suggesting that, Dunia, you have argued as such, but I thought it's an important point to emphasize. Here, I think some of the work, especially in the law and development context, in terms of thinking about law as a problem-solving device, is to think carefully about, again, is it that lawyers are simply following a particular view of how this law should be enacted, or are the lawyers actually themselves actively involved in designing these laws? And I think this is a really important point. I know that your work, Dunia, on international investment law would alert you to this issue. So I would say, is the kind of economist that is going to be informing the kind of fiscal responsibility laws, sort of the kind of economist that informed the neoliberal turn in New Zealand in the mid-1980s that Jane Kelsey writes about? Or would it be the kind of Stiglitz, Joseph Stiglitz, post, World Bank tenure, writing the book Globalization and Its Discontents and heading the Stiglitz Commission after the 2008 financial crisis? I think there's a whole continuum there. And I think that you alluded to this as well, and I think the second paper I'm going to be commenting on does a great job about this. And this is whether or not these fiscal responsibility laws will come inbuilt with them with a kind of conditionalities that require austerity. So while the focus on fiscal responsibility laws is important, I think that one of the issues that both this paper and the next paper may want to think about is how this relates to issues of the systemic, the issues of the systemic risk. So, for example, the Stiglitz Commission, formed after the 2008 financial crisis, noted the urgent need to develop an equitable sovereign debt restructuring mechanism, as well as an improved framework for handling cross-border bankruptcies. All those issues that we've sort of been thinking in this space of sovereign debt over the last several years, and not just with the COVID-19 pandemic, about the fact that the world currently lacks a sustainable mechanism for addressing what we know are systemic risks, because capital flows across national boundaries without any limits is a really important issue. I know that this is the work that Cephas Lumina worked on as a special rapporteur on issues relating to debt. And I do highly recommend the work of Cephas. I mean, he's a really humble guy. I liked his comments a few minutes ago. And I think that we should all turn to the work that he did in that context, because his work addressed many of those systemic issues of risk that are highly correlated with all the challenges our economies are facing in the COVID-19 pandemic. And so the COVID-19 pandemic moment is just one in a long series of moments that we know our economies are facing, and that any reforms at the domestic level that are not accompanied by changes to address the question of systemic risk at the global level are going to be inadequate. So I think that's the last comment that I wanted to make about this paper, that domestic economies are integrated within a global financial system that has this inbuilt systemic risks, and that whatever changes we make at the national level without addressing them at the global level, in my view, would be inadequate. We're going to be talking about another debt crisis in a couple of years if we are able to survive this one and together with the pandemic. So Magali, should I go to the next paper or should I shut up? And,
No, please go ahead. I think we can deal with your comments on the last paper and then we'll open up the floor.
Okay, so let me open my comments here. So I liked this paper as well. My apologies. I wasn't able to print this out, so I'm using my my laptop. So Marie-Louise Aron's paper is a really well-written paper. And as she herself told us, without repeating her argument, she argues very strongly in favor of proactive debt management strategies through limiting unsustainable negative growth. And we all followed her presentation, so I don't want to summarize that. I want to go straight to my comments. I think I like the emphasis on how we could make borrowing more sustainable. I think she has great suggestions. And I liked very much her emphasis on how unsustainable levels of debt are likely to be accompanied by austerity budgets. I'm sure you know about the recent studies that Oxfam has been doing, examining IMF loans in the pandemic period, in the COVID-19 pandemic period, where they found that 84% of IMF loans extended during the pandemic suggest or require countries to adopt tough austerity measures. I really find the work that Oxfam has done in this context to be really important for all of us who are looking at the question of sovereign debt at this moment. The fact that the IMF's interventions are accompanied by conditionalities is also consistent with the argument in this paper about sort of being concerned about how we protect vulnerable populations. So I think that maybe that's sort of another source that the author can look at for this paper. And then sort of to, the other overall comment that I wanted to make about this paper is regarding something that already mentioned with reference to the previous paper. This relates to the point she made, particularly about corruption. And I think, I would encourage you to be a little bolder. There's been a lot of literature on state capture there in South Africa. And maybe perhaps because you're writing your PhD, you don't want to be controversial, but this is not controversial. I mean, this question of state capture has been really been in the news. It's sort of public knowledge. And I think what this notion of state capture in South Africa shows, and it's not just in South Africa, it's in many places, it shows that the South African state, like many African states, are not autonomous from international capital. And in fact, and I'm happy to send my comments in writing, I would refer you to some of the work done by sociologists one paper by Val Buris and Clifford Staples, who in 2012 argued as follows, that as transnational corporations become increasingly global in their operation, the elites who own and control these corporations will also cease to be organized or divided along national lines. And then they added, we are witnessing the formation of a transnational capitalist class whose social networks, affiliations, and identities will no longer be embedded primarily in the roles they occupy as citizens of specific nations. So to properly understand this transnational capitalist, it is necessary to study what the authors call these interlocking directorates, defined as the structure of interpersonal or interorganizational relations that is created whenever a director of one corporation sits on the governing board of another corporation. I mean, we all know the South African president, long before he became the president of South Africa, was a director of a leading multinational that is not associated with very good things, both in South Africa and elsewhere. And I think that we should be bold to name these issues in our scholarship. This is not politics. This is just what the reality is. That sometimes we tend to think of our nation states as separate from, transnational capital. Well, in fact, these states are deeply embedded within the systems of international capital. And therefore, I think the lessons that we could learn from Mozambique on the debt issue is the importance of the South African government listening to the vision presented by South African labor organizations, environmental groups, and social movements and opposition political parties, particularly because the ANC is a juggernaut that has really adopted, for the most part, what in my view are really neoliberal policies very much along the lines of the New Zealand government in the mid-1980s. And the point that I want to sort of, I guess, end on here is to suggest that we should also pay attention to the questions of systemic risks of capital flows created by the fact that our elites are really willing to borrow money, even in this era of the COVID-19 pandemic, without sort of worrying about the next crisis that's around the corner, and without any systems in place in the international system for addressing those systemic risks. So thank you very much. Congratulations for really great papers, and thank you for the opportunity to comment on them.
Thank you. Thank you so much for those great comments. So we've heard from our two commentators. So I'd like to open the floor to the authors to see what their reactions are, whether they have questions, whether they themselves have responses or comments to this. And I'd also like to open the floor to everyone else. Please put your comments in the chat box or raise your hand, and we can hand over to you before Professor Danny Bradlow and I conclude the session. So authors, does any of you have anything to say in response to the comments by Professor Cephas Limina and Prof. James Gatti?
Thank you, Mkhali. I'd just like to thank Professor Limina for taking the time to comment on my paper, and I'll definitely expand on the UN Convention Against Corruption, particularly where addressing the investor-state arbitration. So with Patel versus Mirza, the main reason, Prof, why I hadn't looked at it in such detail is because of this distinguishment by the English courts between an agreement invalid in itself and an agreement procured through corruption. But I do agree with you, Prof, it's particularly with reference to the exgorgement argument. There I could definitely refer to Patel a bit more, even though Patel itself also dealt with an agreement that was invalid in itself. It does remain relevant with respect to the unjustified enrichment. So thank you very much for that comment, Prof.
Okay.
Yeah, please all go ahead. Just jump in.
All right. Thank you so much, Prof. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Prof. I've listened to your comments and I've taken notes of everything you have said. Talking about corruption and state capture can be quite dicey, but I would do as you have suggested and incorporate it in my work going further. Thank you so much for taking the time to comment and read my work. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for that comment. Denai Zongwe, do you have any comments or responses?
Yes, I have comments and responses. I'll try to be very brief, but I have to say very quickly at the beginning, I want to thank Professor James Gatti for his very insightful comments. And I have to say very quickly that some of them, as you can see, my paper is still work in progress. And I think that I would make the most of Professor Gatti's comments by incorporating them rather than try to respond to these things. I think that a criticism are a blessing, and those ones were definitely very important. That said, on the first question on the provenance, Professor Gatti is correct. It comes from New Zealand at the time when New Zealand was actually taking the neoliberal term. But the interesting thing with the new banking legislation in Namibia is that it's also a neoliberal legislation. So in a sense, the current situation and the fiscal responsibility that I'm advocating have some history and connections to neoliberalism. Central banking itself is dominated by neoliberal ideas. And that's not surprising when you see that the central bank has been given fiscal authority. I also agree with Professor Gatti that the media, the civil society organizations have a big role to play. In Namibia, it was the media that, let's say, revealed last year the ugliest corruption scandal that took place in the country since independence. So they have a big role to play, especially when it comes to debating the budget. So I 100% agree with Professor Gatti. I would just add that the media has not been as good in criticizing or providing insight on the budgetary process, and especially debt sustainability. But I still believe, like Professor Gatti has said, that civil society organizations have a big role to play in this process. Let me say that the fiscal responsibility that I'm advocating, even from my presentation, the idea is really to democratize the process. I've heard from Professor Gatti and even from some of the speakers that we should be careful about austerity and so forth. Well, my starting point is a bit different. My starting point is that it's not really so much a choice between austerity or not austerity. You are going to face a major debt crisis because this pandemic and the future ones to come leave you with no choice than to take more money. The question is how you mitigate. So it's not a question of whether you go about austerity or not. At least that's how I see now. I'll investigate more. But my question is really, how do you mitigate the damage? Because it's inevitable. You're going to have to take a lot of debt. The question is, how do you manage that debt? That's one thing, fiscal prudence. That's how I came up with the emphasis on fiscal prudence. My starting point is different. My starting point is not that you can take a number of actions to grow the economy. The economy is going to take a hit because this crisis is unique in that sense, in the sense that it basically affected the whole globe. So the question is more, how do you mitigate through fiscal prudence this kind of devastating hit? So quickly, civil society groups, again, question number 2 by Professor Gatti. Generally speaking, again, I agree. I have to mention that even in central banking, John Maynard Keynes was very, very skeptical about this idea that you should give monetary policy, you should leave it to technocrats. He was very skeptical, but unfortunately today, central banking are neoliberal institutions, not all of them, but most of them, including the one in Namibia, and I know some people may also dispute that, but even the one in South Africa. The reason why I'm mentioning South Africa is because there is, through the Common Monetary Area, banks in Southern Africa must coordinate their monetary policies. I'm talking about South Africa, Namibia, Lesotho, Swaziland, or Eswatini. So that I mentioned, I also agree with Professor Gatti about the lawyer's fallacy, the idea that if you come up with the law, you can solve the issue. In fact, my approach, even in the paper that I submitted, you'll see that my approach is trying to avoid a legalistic approach, because I'm aware, and in fact, I even mentioned that if you look at the empirical evidence, it is not conclusive. Some empirical evidence points to the fact that fiscal responsibility has managed to improve debt sustainability, but other empirical research has actually demonstrated the opposite, that actually fiscal responsibility law at best has no impact on debt sustainability. So I'm pretty much aware of that. That's why I was saying that we should basically not focus so much on the law itself as on the framework. Professor Gatti mentioned Brazil. In Brazil, it's interesting when you look at the evidence in Brazil, people even say that, well, if you look at some of the evidence, they say, well, in Brazil, fiscal responsibility laws have succeeded. But some evidence say that, no, it has not succeeded. It has only led to creative accounting. People have become just more creative about accounting. When they incur debt, instead of reporting it this year, they'll report it to next year. And they give you the impression that they're actually complying with fiscal responsibility laws, while in reality, they're simply becoming very inventive and very imaginative about how they go about, the budget, both at the federal and the state level. I very much liked Professor Gatti's comment about private causes of action. This is something that I've honestly not thought about, but I think I will include it in the revised paper. I also liked the connection between larger context. In fact, when you talk about central banking, you cannot divorce the national jurisdiction to the greater context. There seems to be quite a great level of, I won't say uniformity, but harmonization when it comes to central banking. And then I think that should, that should conclude, the conditionality, sorry, and the systemic risk. That I think is the last point that I wanted to deal with. Let me see, yes. I want to say also that one of the reasons why, and I'm saying this also in response to what Professor Gatti said, why I'm skeptical about locating the Fiscal Council within the central bank is that the location is not only institutional, the location is also ideological. When you locate the fiscal authority or the Fiscal Council within the central bank, you're locating it within the framework of a neoliberal institution. It is not very easy to change, even if some of you were the central bank governor, you would find yourself in that straitjacket, because many of the rules that you end up implementing are rules that are not only decided at the national level, but also at the regional.
Sorry, in the interest of time, I'll give you 1 more minute to wrap up, if you don't mind.
No, but I'm almost done. I would just conclude by saying that in my approach, I do not only emphasize the legal one. In fact, the paper actually use a law and economics approach, in the sense that I focus on the incentives. And when I would be finalizing the paper, I would especially look at how what I'm suggesting will influence the incentives of the government when it comes to budget and fiscal policy. Having said that, thank you very much for the questions. As I said, the aim for me is not to respond. Responding to the question for me is not as important as receiving those comments in the first place. Thank you very much, Professor Gatti, for those very insightful comments.
Thank you. Now let's move on to the floor. Does anybody have comments, questions, thoughts on the 3 presentations that have been made today? So feel free to raise your hand. Okay, I can see Barry Herman. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I was participating yesterday as well as today. So yesterday it was the finance people. Today, it's the lawyers, and it's kind of interesting, the different perspectives. I have some thoughts about each of the papers, and I thought I would share. Oh, and also this was a great opportunity to see Cephas. I haven't seen him in many years, and glad to see he is thriving, and he is a prof. We go back some years. Okay, fiscal responsibility law. It's an interesting rhetorical turn of phrase, since the opposite is irresponsibility. And who can be in favor of irresponsibility? But I think it would be irresponsible to have budget ceilings that are not sensitive to the economic situation. And so that I think, and it wasn't clear to me if this was taken into account, but the only way that's proper to do this is a cyclically adjusted budget balance, so that automatic stabilizers, can take effect, and for sure governments will need to borrow during downturns, during pandemics, and so on. And in fact, the IMF is reviewing this today. It has just released a new paper on the question of debt limits that countries should be held to when they come to request IMF assistance. On Mozambique, fascinating case. It seems that because the government had some bad advice, it took responsibility in the new bonds that were issued with a sovereign obligation to repay. And there's a focus in, I guess, British law of when the government is influenced by a bribe, but there's no consequence, it seems, for the briber. And it seemed that was a bit unbalanced. Is there some other angle by which the briber can be held accountable? Finally, on austerity and what's coming, again on the IMF, something I mentioned yesterday, but is worth repeating. The IMF has adopted policy on social spending. And as they give these loans, which will replace the rapidly dispersed loans from this year, it will be a challenge that I think civil society will necessarily need to push back on the IMF, because they are now committed to protecting social spending, which is education and health, as well as social protection. And, the IMF talks about vulnerable populations, which can be interpreted as the poorest of the poor. This is the way it was interpreted in Argentina in the previous IMF program. But I think you need to talk about people who become poor because they've lost their employment. So I think it's going to be a question for political struggle in countries so that austerity gets interpreted in some socially responsible way. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Are there any other comments from the audience before Danny Bradlow and I wrap up the session with our comments? Does anyone else from the audience have a question, a comment, a thought, an idea to share? You can raise your hand or type it in quickly. Yes, please go ahead. I'll take only, I think, 2 more comments in the interest of time, but please proceed. Okay, I see nothing from the audience, and I'm just scrolling through. I hope there are no comments that I have missed, and if there are, please just unmute yourself and do share your thoughts. But until I see anything from anyone else, I will proceed with a few of my thoughts. So mine are quite brief. The two commentators have done, I think, justice to all the papers and have shared quite a lot of their ideas, some of which I share as well. So some of my thoughts are as follows, and just very briefly. So the paper on Mozambique, so to Mr. Cohen, yeah, I was expecting to see a little bit more about shared responsibility, and I'm quite happy of the fact that Barry Herman also mentioned this. I was also expecting to see a little bit more on ODS debt. I mean, you do have a few lines, and you do indicate the controversies, but I was expecting to see a little bit more on that, even in the footnotes. Would have to speak a little bit more on whether that amendment would impact the length of the paper and how so. But I think it adds value to have a little bit more on the shared responsibility, the ODS debt, as well as some mention of some of the voluntary principles that have arisen due to the very complex case of Mozambique. But we'll provide written comments on this and elaborate further. On the paper on South Africa by Mary Louise Aaron, so I do have a few comments. Some of them are really structural, and I can provide those as written comments later, such as the need for some additional information and footnotes on some areas. You've referred to your concern that Africa might slip into potential hyperinflation, and you've provided the illustration of Germany 1920, which is literally 100 years ago. I feel like there could be some examples that are more recent, Zimbabwe, Venezuela. So these issues I will provide written comments on, and even on the structure of the paper. I was expecting to see a little bit more on the challenges faced that relate to debt management in South Africa. In your introduction, you do deal with COVID-19, which is the immediate trigger. However, South Africa is quite a complex case, and beyond COVID-19, there are quite a number of issues that have so COVID-19 is really just a catalyst, and it really exposes problems that existed far before this pandemic. You've touched on it briefly in your recommendations when you've spoken about corruption and transparency and so forth, but there wasn't, in my view, a detailed enough assessment of some of these challenges. And even a little bit more could be done on some of the recommendations, but Danny Bradlow and I will provide written comments on this paper. On the paper on Namibia and fiscal responsibility laws, I found this very, very interesting. I just had one thought. It's not so much a comment, it's just a thought, but I was thinking about beyond fiscal responsibility, there's also, I guess, expenditure behavior that comes from, that could be controlled by having very good and transparent public procurement laws. So I was also asking myself whether there's a link between this fiscal responsibility legislations that you are proposing and maybe also strengthening public procurement laws. So those were some of my very broad thoughts. Danny Bradlow, do you have any thoughts? And I'm looking in the chat. I can see we have a few comments. There's a question on whether the presentations will be shared. These can be shared, the presentation slides. You've also asked about today's video. We are live on Facebook, and the video will be there. Is there on the Center for Human Rights Facebook page. I don't see any other comments beyond appreciation, unless I'm mistaken. So Danny Bradlow, shall I hand over to you for final comments?
Great. Excuse me. Thanks, Magali. I'm assuming everyone can hear me. I want to begin by congratulating the three presenters on the great quality of their papers, and based on the presentations today, and I'm confident that they will improve the papers, taking into account the excellent feedback that they received from Professor Lumina and Professor Gatti, and the bonus of extra comments from Barry Herman, which I think give you lots of room to work with. I also think that this discussion's also made me realize the benefit of this project, of focusing on a specific region and looking at countries and looking at how countries can learn from each other's examples. And hopefully that will help enrich each of your presentations as well. I'm going to make a couple of comments on each paper. In no particular order, I'm going to start with Louis Kuhn's paper on Mozambique, which it raised an issue for me, two issues for me, which I've been, every time I read about the Mozambican case or participate in discussions about it, keep coming back to me, and I never seem to get an answer, and I'm wondering if I'm wrong or if there's something to this. One is, what are the chances that the English courts will give comity to the Mozambican Constitutional Council's judgment and uphold that and respect that and say it's clear that this transaction is tainted by corruption and that they respect the decision of the Mozambican courts and therefore refuse to enforce this, is number one. The second question that I have is, I know the creditors in that case very prudently got formal legal opinion letters telling that they had followed the correct procedures in Mozambique. But I think we all know that's not necessarily the whole story, and that they probably understood full well that they were probably not following the correct procedures, and certainly they should have known from what the law says that they weren't following it, and whether there's any possibility that the courts will set aside those opinion letters and say you should have known through proper due diligence that these were invalid contracts and set it aside for those reasons. So those are two questions for you. It would be interesting to see what answers you can, if you think they're good questions, what answers you come up with that. On Marie-Louise Aaron's paper, which is a very interesting paper, I would say my major comment is, I think you need to be a bit more specific and a bit more skeptical in the solutions you propose. They're all very reasonable, rational, and good solutions. But I think we also need to think a little bit about why they're not being implemented. Because I think they raise issues about institutional development and governance deficiencies in countries. And so that there's some thought should be given. Are there ways around that? Also, I think, and I think Barry Herman alluded to this, the austerity budget debate is an important debate. The idea of not having austerity, but having GDP enhancing spending is an important issue. But I think it needs to be probed more, because it's not so clear cut to me that austerity and GDP enhancing spending are mutually exclusive, and they don't necessarily, GDP enhancing spending doesn't necessarily get at the important social dimensions and the social spending that need to be done. Because shifting spending to building infrastructure has long-term benefits, but it doesn't deal with some of the short-term social consequences of the situation. The final one is, it struck me reading your paper and then reading Professor Zongwe's paper that it might be good for the two of you to have a discussion about fiscal responsibility laws, and if there's any relevance or any mileage that you could gain from you thinking about a fiscal responsibility law for South Africa in some way. Then on Professor Zongwe's paper, a few things struck me. One is, as I was thinking about the fiscal responsibility law and its genesis from New Zealand, I was trying to remember, and unfortunately didn't have the time to go back and confirm this, but did the fiscal responsibility law come in at the same time that New Zealand introduced inflation targeting? Because as you know, inflation targeting comes from New Zealand, and I wonder what the connection between those two is. Were they introducing the fiscal responsibility law to deal on the fiscal side with the constraints they were trying to put on the central bank in terms of inflation, and what the connections between those might be? Second thing, I was intrigued, and I think I heard and understood correctly, that the Fiscal Council in Namibia is in the central bank. And that struck me as an interesting mix of fiscal and monetary roles for a central bank. And it would be interesting to know more about how they manage those two roles and what the implications of those are for the independence of the central bank. Third point on that, I was hoping you would say more about your idea of the IMF as an insurer of government budget. I'm not 100% sure what that means, and I would be interested to learn more about that. And you had a throwaway line in your paper about an African monetary fund as a possible alternative to the IMF. As you may know, there isn't a treaty to create an African monetary fund that has enough signatories on it to enter into force, but it hasn't been ratified yet by enough countries to do that. And then the final point is, I was wondering if you've given any thought to the Open Budget Project, which had at one point an initiative on a global initiative on fiscal responsibility, on fiscal transparency, and that was trying to develop some international standards around that. It had a number of countries participating in it, including South Africa from this region. I don't remember if Namibia was involved, but it might be worth looking into the work of them to see if they have any material that would be useful for your paper. Those are my comments. I want to take this opportunity while I'm speaking to thank the speakers again, to thank our commentators really for really enriching this discussion, to thank Magali not just for chairing this session, but also for all the hard work she's done putting all these together. And so she deserves the last word on this. So let me hand back to Magali to close us off.
Thank you so much, Prof. So I guess we've come to the end of our session. It was a very successful one, I believe. The presentations were fantastic. Thank you to the commentators for participating. I know that you took quite a lot of time out of your busy schedules at such a short notice to make time to look at these papers, and we really appreciate that you did go through them thoroughly and you provided comments that will definitely improve these papers. So I believe that the discussion doesn't end here. We will provide written comments and we can still go back and forth with the authors until we come up with a good final papers. So to all the participants, thank you very much, because this is also not possible without you. And thank you for your contributions as well. The audience, Barry Herman, thank you very much for your thoughts as well. Our next session will be next week on the 24th, where we have the next set of 4 papers. So the 24th is, I believe, next week, Tuesday. And again, we also have a very interesting group of commentators. So I hope you'll all join us. And yeah, I guess the session is closed for today and we'll be speaking next week, Tuesday. Thank you very much and bye.